morning. Thank you very much. Mr. Sharland, I understand you have an application.
Well, good morning, Chair. I wanted to raise an issue in relation to the first witness, Ms. Churcher. As I believe you're aware, a new version of the evident proposal topics list was sent to my instructing solicitor 5 to 7 last night. Ms. Churcher didn't see that last night. She's not had an opportunity to consider the new documents. I think there's 7 new documents. And we do have very significant concerns about the fairness of expecting her to be able to address those new documents without any opportunity to consider them, and also to consider other possible documents that may be relevant. The vast majority of other witnesses have had a proper opportunity to consider documents before they give evidence. I'm not seeking to criticise counsel's inquiry in any way. I understand there is a huge amount to do, and part of the reason why this was so late is Ms. Church's witness statement wasn't finalised until last Friday. But we do have real concerns about the fairness. And Ms. Churcher will do her best, but it may well be that in relation to most of these documents, she's not in a position to give a particularly helpful answer. And what we would suggest is, if she's not able to do so today, she does so by a supplementary witness statement, which has been what has been suggested to a number of the other witnesses, because she does have to have a fair opportunity to consider the documents put to her, and also other relevant documents which she's not had a chance to look at. So I'm not actually applying to ask you to make any decision. I just want to raise this and explain what I think is the best way forward.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it, Mr. Sharland.
Very grateful.
I mean, as you say, obviously, we're working at pace, and my understanding is that many of these documents are actually in relation to Rule 10 applications that have been made by core participants. So obviously the timeframes are such that, you know, we're in the position that we're in. But I do absolutely take your point. And, you know, my expectation is just that the witness answers to the best of her ability. Where she's not able to answer because she hasn't had time to consider the documents and feels that she needs access to additional information, that, of course, is reasonable. And as you suggest, I think making a supplementary witness statement at a later point would be an acceptable way to address that. So thank you for raising it.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We can call Ms. Church now.
Thank you very much. Would you like to swear in the witness? Thank you very much.
If you read after me, I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
and
the
nothing
truth.
but the truth.
Good morning, Ms. Churcher. Just to say, I understand that there are some documents that you've only had recent access to. So I would just ask that you answer any questions that Ms. Moore puts to you just to the best of your ability, and explain if there are questions that you're not able to answer without further information. If you could just explain that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Moore, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Churcher. Could you just confirm your full name for us?
Karen Deborah Churcher.
And you should have a bundle of documents, a folder there in front of you. I may refer you to those, and I may show documents on the screen, which might be a bit easier to see. At tab 1 of that folder, you have your first witness statement, which you make to the inquiry and which is dated the 1st of November 2021. That will be adduced in full, please. The reference for that is and that's dated 4th of March 2022. Again, that will be adduced in full, and the reference is DWF 000022. And the reason I'm saying they're adduced, Ms. Churcher, is that it means we don't have to go over everything that's in your statements. That's already your evidence to the inquiry, and we'll just focus on some of the key issues that the inquiry wants to hear from you about. So you're a registered mental health nurse.
Yes.
And you qualified in that profession in 1998, I believe 5 years after having already qualified as a learning disability. Boots before in April 2016 starting to work at Brook House.
Yes.
And so during the relevant period, so when we say that we mean April to August 2017, you were working at Brook House as a registered mental health nurse.
Yes.
And was Sandra Culver your line manager?
Yes.
In 2018, June 2018, you were promoted to senior nurse,
Yes.
still within Brook House. And I understand you left full-time employment at Brook House in October 2018, but you stayed on occasionally working there as a bank nurse.
Yes.
And that was until the 28th of February 2019.
Yes.
And then did you leave completely and not do any further bank shifts there?
No, no more.
You describe in your first statement at page 2 your recruitment and induction at Brook House. And at pages 3 and 4, you say in summary, but tell me if my summary is wrong, the training was fine, but you would have liked training on the Home Office and their policies.
Yes.
And you go on to say that should have been annual, or it would have been helpful if it was annual.
Yes.
And you say at 22, paragraph 22 of your first statement, that you weren't familiar with Rule 35 when you joined at Brook House. And you help us with this further in your second statement at pages 13 to 14. I'll read it out, but it's from paragraph 57 onwards. You say, I did not receive Rule 35 training until around a year after I joined Brook House. Prior to receiving that training, the doctors would see detainees on arrival, and the detainees would usually make it known that they'd been victims of torture. If it wasn't raised at the time of arrival, it was normally raised with their solicitors or healthcare staff, and a Rule 35 referral could be made. You say that the process for arranging a Rule 35 report was that the RGNs, so the registered general nurses, would make a Rule 35 appointment with a doctor initially, and the doctors would produce a Rule 35 report and fax it to the detainee's solicitor and the Home Office. And then you say at 59 that the training, which is the training you had a year after, improved my understanding of Rule 35 appointments and reports. You say, until that training, I hadn't realised that I could request a Rule 35 report for someone who had severe mental health issues. It improved my knowledge of the process and the procedures to be followed. So before the training, the doctors would review them and make the Rule 35 appointment, and if not, healthcare staff or their solicitors could ask for that to be made.
Yes.
And was that different after the training?
No, it was exactly the same. We could all sort of, I think it slightly changed that there was a different appointment system, so I could ask directly that the doctor review for Rule 35, whereas normally I would just have to tell the person to go to healthcare to request it.
So before you had the training, you'd say to the person, go and ask for a Rule 35 appointment.
Yes.
I see. And where you say at paragraph 59, until I had the training, I hadn't realised that I could request a Rule 35 report. Is that what you're referring to? You didn't realise that you could tell the doctor without the patient being the middleman, effectively?
Yes.
And you say that you hadn't realised that you could request a Rule 35 report for someone who had severe mental health issues. Are you saying there that before then you thought it was just related to torture, or did you always know that there was an element of mental health issues at play?
I thought there was an element of any health issue. Therefore, I would normally recommend anyone that I saw apply for a Rule 35 and seek help from medical justice.
I want to ask you quickly about healthcare staffing. So you've been asked about this in your statement, and you've gone into some detail there. Just to focus on 41, paragraph 41 of your second statement, you say that there were weeks during the relevant period when emergency responses would be called every 15 minutes due to a detainee being under the influence of drugs and alcohol and in need of an immediate response. And you say, I do not think that the number of RMNs, and when I say that, I'm saying registered mental health nurses like yourself, on shift was appropriate to meet the detainee needs during this period. RMNs could be having a one-to-one session with a detainee and forced to abandon it if you had to attend an emergency. So an emergency takes precedence and you might have to leave to attend that. And I think Mr. Lawton in his evidence also said that there weren't sufficient RMNs and that effectively they were important and therefore very stretched.
Yes.
how often, roughly, would you have to be called away from a session to attend an emergency?
There was a set period when there was a lot of spice in the unit, and that would be on a daily basis. But out of that period, not often at all.
Do you remember approximately how long that period lasted when there was a real spike in spice taking?
I think it was about 2 weeks.
Yep. Otherwise, would you say that there was sufficient RMN cover in the centre?
No.
How did that affect your day-to-day work?
It made it difficult. It made it difficult.
Because you had lots of people to see and not much time to see them.
Yes, and also we did the Rule 40 reviews, the ACDT reviews, and it made it difficult for the officers as well because we all had to interlink and meet up at the same time.
To do, for example, a ACDT or a Rule 40, so
Yes.
coordinating everyone's time when you have a packed time schedule. And you also have to, of course, do your clinical work, so your
Yes,
mental health
yeah.
assessments.
Yeah.
Fine. Just to ask a question about something you mentioned in your first statement at page 7, paragraph 49, you're asked about the Home Office. And you say, if we had a patient that we knew was unwell, we would ask the Home Office if there was a flight booked for them. Is that right?
Yes.
And why was that?
Well, normally, so that we had a bit of prior notice of what they were going through. Sometimes they knew, but they wouldn't tell us. So sometimes it was sort of knowing their whole situation.
Because it might cause them more distress
Yeah,
or...
exactly.
Okay. Onto induction. You mentioned this in your statement at paragraph 53, and you say that healthcare assistants usually carried out the healthcare screening on new arrivals. Is that right? And you said it would be supervised and signed off by an RGN, so not a mental health nurse, a registered general nurse. And when you say it would be supervised by an RGN, is that normally it would be the healthcare assistant speaking to the detainee, but there'd be someone there if they needed to call on? Or do you not know?
I don't really know because I didn't get involved in that process.
Would you agree that that initial screening is quite an important time to capture somebody's mental state?
Yes.
And for concerns to be raised that can then be passed on to you or the doctors?
Yes.
We have an account of induction by one of the detained persons, D643. This gentleman gave evidence to the inquiry back in February, on 22nd of February. And he's a gentleman who'd been moved from the Verne specifically because he had combat-related PTSD. So he'd been a veteran in the British Army. There was an alarm in the Verne that triggered his PTSD, and then he was removed to Brook House because they didn't have the same alarm, effectively. Thank you, Chair.
My apologies.
We understand we had a problem with the live feed, but it seems to be resolved now. So I'll continue with questions.
Thank you very
to
much.
Churchill. So, Mr. Churchill, as to the cohort of detained people or patients that you had at Brook House, they had a variety of mental health conditions and needs.
Yes.
Dr. Bingham, who's a GP who's a clinical advisor for medical justice, provided a statement to the inquiry. And if I refer to this, I'll say it's Dr. Bingham's statement. And we have that at BHM 000033. At page 10, she discusses challenges for doctors specifically, but it's about the patient cohort, so you might find that it equally applies to you as a RMN. And she says, under the heading Challenges for Doctors Working in Immigration Detention, research suggests that a high proportion of immigration detainees display clinically significant levels of depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and anxiety, as well as intense fear, sleep disturbances, profound hopelessness, self-harm, and suicidal ideation. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
She says, stresses associated with detention, including the sudden nature of being detained, uncertainty and anxiety about the future, separation from social support and other coping mechanisms, and the highly stressful environment of detention exacerbate all of these mental health issues.
Yes.
And she says detention can also be very disruptive to healthcare, with pre-detention medical care being stopped abruptly, hospital appointments missed, and scheduled treatment cancelled.
Yes.
And torture isn't mentioned specifically in that section, but it's something I want to go on to ask you about. Would you agree that there's a much higher prevalence amongst the detained population than the general population of a history of torture?
Yes, yes.
And this can give rise to complex health needs. I'm going to ask you now about a number of individuals with whom you had some or lots of contact while you were at Brook House. And the first is an individual we're referring to as D1527. So you had significant contact with him around the relevant period. And your second statement at pages 16 to 20 deal with that contact. You say that you were his main point of contact in terms of healthcare, I understand.
Yes.
His first healthcare entry at Brook House was on the 4th of April 2017. On the 5th of April, he was seen by Dr. Chowdhury, to whom he disclosed a history of mental illness and that he was on antidepressants. And on the 11th of April, he disclosed a history of torture, and so Rule 35 pre-assessment was booked. And then the Rule 35 assessment was done by Dr. Uzerali on the 13th of April. Now it's 79 of your statement, page 79, sorry, paragraph 79. You list a number of times he disclosed suicidal intent to you, so I'll let you turn it up. The first time you say was on the 12th of April 2017, as you note, and I won't ask you to turn to them unless you'd like to refresh your memory, but to illustrate what he said to you, we have your notes made in his records, and the note that you made on the 12th of April sets out his history of torture, says he presents as depressed and is on medication, but has not taken any for the last 2 days, and you've advised him to set an alarm. Superficially self-harmed at the weekend, given elastic bands and advised on how to use them. States he had active thoughts to kill himself. Has a plan to hang via his bed sheets, kicking over the chair so that he dies. Informed that Oscar 1 would have to be informed about his disclosure, was not happy as he does not wish to be watched, just wants to die, and it says worked on positive forward thinking. So from that note, you knew then from at least the 12th of April onwards that he had a mental illness,
Yes.
and suicidal, active suicidal thoughts, as you
Yes.
described them, and also that he had a history of torture.
Yes.
I want to ask you about Rule 35 of the Detention Centre rules, specifically Rule 35.2. And Rule 35.2 states, I'll read it, the medical practitioner shall report to the manager on the case of any detained person he suspects of having suicidal intentions, and the detained person shall be placed under special observation for so long as those suspicions remain, and a record of his treatment and condition shall be kept throughout that time in a manner to be determined by the Secretary of State. So I think you've agreed that D1527 did have suicidal intentions on the 12th of April and thereafter.
Yes.
It's not a matter of suspecting he did. He told you about them and about his plan. And at page 17 of your statement, paragraph 79, you say that he disclosed suicidal intent to you on a number of other occasions. So you say 13th of April, 21st of April, 2nd of May, and on the 2nd of May you were present when Dr. Belder diagnosed him with PTSD as well. Dr. Belder's a psychiatrist.
Psychiatrist.
Do you agree, in hindsight, that a doctor should have been made aware that he should have been referred for an assessment under Rule 35.2 on this occasion?
Well, he was referred for a Rule 35. I don't choose what part he was referred. He just went for a Rule 35 assessment with the doctor.
So did you understand at the time that there was a difference between a Rule 35.3 assessment, which is related to torture, and the option of a Rule 35.2 assessment for somebody who's suspected of having suicidal intentions?
No.
And you were asked about a possible Rule 35.2 for D1527, and you said in your statement that, as you've just said, he had one on the 13th of April, which is the torture Rule 35.3 assessment you're referring to. You say, I don't know if he'd received the response yet, but the Home Office would not have entertained 2 Rule 35 reports being requested so close together.
Yeah.
So there's the occasion where he has the Rule 35.3, which is the 13th of April, and then there's a number of other disclosures to you of suicidal intent, which would give rise to a 35.2, but you say can't do 2 so close together.
Well, I presumed that you're talking about a day apart, aren't you?
So, as you set out in your statement at paragraph 79, it's not just the 13th of April. He again disclosed suicidal intent to you on the 21st of April, and again on the 2nd of May.
Okay.
So, were they other opportunities to refer him for a Rule 35(2) assessment?
I wasn't the one responsible for referring for the Rule 35s. I would have had discussions with the ACDTs and things like that, but the RGNs used to put forward the Rule 35s. It would have advised him to go for Rule 35s.
Would you have advised him to go for a Rule 35 on the basis of his suicidal intentions at the time, or did you not understand that that was what was covered by Rule 35(2)?
I would have advised him because things had changed in his presentation.
And do you accept that in his notes it doesn't suggest anywhere that you advised him to go for a Rule 35(2) assessment?
Yeah, I don't always document it. The same way I don't document if I advise somebody to contact medical justice.
So are you assuming, or do you remember that you asked D1527 to attend for a Rule 35 on the basis of his suicidal intentions?
I'm assuming. I don't remember.
And when you were asked by us about Rule 35(2) by D1527, you said the Home Office would not have entertained 2 Rule 35 reports requested so close together. Can you help us with why you thought that the Home Office wouldn't consider 2 so close together?
I was led to believe that you couldn't put 2 in too close together. Maybe that was the wrong assumption, but that's...
Do you remember how you got that impression?
No.
Do you remember if it was something you heard from the Home Office or from a colleague in healthcare?
It must have been from healthcare.
And do you remember whether other people in healthcare shared that view? So was it sort of received wisdom among the group that you couldn't do 2 close together?
I don't know. I can't comment, sorry.
Even if you suspected that the Home Office wouldn't entertain 2 close together, would you accept that there's nothing in the rules that says that that's not the case?
Yeah, I would. Now looking at the rules, yes.
During the relevant period, there were no Rule 35(2) reports done at Brook House at all. In fact, Home Office data suggests there were none done between 2015 and 2021, as I understand it. You would agree, I assume, that there were residents at Brook House who were suspected of having suicidal intentions, yes. And D1527 was one of them.
Yes.
Can you help us, as far as you're able to, with why there might have been no Rule 35(2) reports?
I can't comment. I didn't do the Rule 35 reports. I can only, send somebody to have one done.
And Sandra Culver gave evidence to the inquiry on the 1st of March. Were you able to watch her
Yes.
evidence? She was asked about Rule 35(2), and specifically she was asked whether the lack of Rule 35(2) reports suggested that a higher than appropriate threshold was being applied. And she said that was correct. And she was asked, if we look at Rule 35(2), a GP is to do a Rule 35(2) report if he suspects that a detained person had suicidal intentions. Do you agree that a suspicion of suicidal intentions is a much lower threshold than the threshold that she used in her witness statement of severely suicidal? And she said yes, and was asked, it seems as though your understanding of the way these rules were to operate was inaccurate. And she said yes. Do you have a view on whether there was too high a threshold before somebody was referred under Rule 35 in the context of suicidal intentions?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you help us with what you thought the threshold was?
I don't know what the threshold was, but it felt as if it wasn't, a lot of mental health wasn't taken seriously.
Wasn't taken seriously by?
By Home Office, I think. Everything that was discussed between me and 1527 was documented. So when he went for his Rule 35, it was all there. and I documented suicidal intent. I put him on an ACDT. So I'm not sure what other threshold I could do.
So do you now accept, having heard the Rule 35(2) requirement read to you, that when, for example, later in April and in May, he again disclosed suicidal intention, that he could have been referred for a Rule 35(2) assessment?
Oh, in May, yes.
And later in April, after
Yes,
the initial
yeah,
one.
yeah.
And you said that mental health wasn't taken seriously by the Home Office, but is it fair to say that they can only look at the information they're given, and that one of the ways of giving them information is by Rule 35?
Yes.
And you mentioned ACDT as well. I know that there are some respects in which the Home Office can become aware of the information raised there, but they don't have, as far as I understand it, but correct me if I'm wrong, a responsibility to reply to information they hear in an ACDT in the same way that they're required to reply to a Rule 35.
I can't comment on that. I don't know, sorry.
You say in your second statement at page 13, paragraph 57, that you received Rule 35 training a year after you started at Brook House, which we've already discussed. And you say that you hadn't realised that you could request a Rule 35 report for someone who had severe mental health issues. Now, do you now accept that it doesn't require severe mental health issues? That's
Yes.
not the wording of the rules. And again, Miss Calver was asked about Rule 35 training and knowledge amongst her staff. She was asked, do you think the staff have a good understanding or an adequate understanding of the other two limbs of the rule? So she was being asked about Rule 35 1 and 2, and she said no. She was asked, is that a significant gap in knowledge? And she said yes. And she was asked, does that remain today? And she said yes. Do you agree that you and other staff, even after the training you had a year after starting, didn't have a good understanding of Rule 35(2)?
Yes.
So continuing with D1527 in particular, can I ask about a comment you make on paragraph 80 of your second statement? So this is your page 18. And you say there, in relation to this detainee, I disclosed to D1527 that the Home Office chose not to release detainees if there is a risk that they will harm themselves, as detention is a safer place. I had witnessed the Home Office saying this to detainees. They said if we release someone who is vulnerable, then they have no support network and it puts them at risk. They are safer in detention because they have access to a lot of different support. Just if you can remember with relation to D1527, did you know about the support that would be available to him outside detention, or was that not your job to look into?
It wasn't my job to look into, but it wouldn't have been instant.
Can you tell us, you say here, I had witnessed the Home Office saying this to detainees. Do you remember when you'd seen the Home Office telling detained people that detention might be a safer place for them?
I think when somebody had self-harmed, when they were either on constant observations or in Rule 40.
So
at one of the reviews.
So there's Rule 40 or ongoing reviews when someone's under constant supervision. It's attended by people from the Home Office. And are they Home Office sort of staff who are based at Brook House?
Yes.
They're caseworkers? Or they're the on-the-ground...
There's different departments there.
Yeah.
I always got a little bit confused with which ones, yeah.
Okay, so but it would be the Home Office person who's attending to play the Home Office role in a Rule
Yes,
40.
yeah.
And you witnessed them telling detained people that detention might be a safer place for them. And from that, you got the knowledge that that might be true as well.
Yes.
And passed it on, for example, to D1527. Do you remember when this was approximately?
No.
It was, you started it in 2016 and you left in 2019. So we know it was certainly between those times. It was definitely at Brook House. Do you accept now that telling someone that they might not be released if they self-harm might make it more likely that they wouldn't disclose to you suicidal intention, for example?
Yes.
And that they might hide acts of self-harm?
Yes.
And in fact, as we've looked at, it's contrary to Rule 35, which in part looks at the risk of harm, including self-harm, and requires the Home Office to consider that when they think about releasing somebody. And you say in your first statement at 101 that some detainees thought a mental health assessment was a way out of detention, and that they got annoyed sometimes because they came for a mental health assessment and it wasn't a way out of detention. Do you agree that sometimes a mental health assessment can be the first step out of detention if it leads to the conclusion that their mental health requires that they be released.
Yes.
I want to ask briefly then about the Home Office's adults at risk policy. So you were asked about an email in your statement that you and others received from Sandra Calver on the 25th of October 2016. It's a very brief email. It attaches the adults at risk policy, and it said, please read the attached Home Office policy on adults at risk. Please reply that you have read and understood. Do you remember receiving the email?
No, but we did have quite a few of those emails about policies.
So would you tend to get an email with a new policy that says, read and understand this
Yes.
policy? You said at paragraph 16 of your, I think, second statement that you felt a bit out of your depth in relation to adults at risk meetings, which happened after the policy came into place. Is that fair?
Yes.
And you said you didn't know what you were meant to be doing at those meetings always. Did you ever ask for help to understand what adults at risk meetings were for?
Yes. At the meeting, initially they started off and there was just me and one of the managers. A Home Office person was supposed to be there and they weren't.
Yep.
So we didn't know, we had a list, we didn't know what we were supposed to do with the list. We did ask for help and support, and eventually the meetings became quite big meetings, and they were useful.
You say you had a list of detained people,
Yes.
and you asked for support. Do you remember who you asked?
Home Office.
And then their answer was to start attending the meetings?
Sometimes, yes.
Not always.
No.
And was that the case up until when you left?
No. When I left, they were always there, and in fact, there were people from each part of the Home Office. So the departures, they were all there.
And they assisted in your understanding by attending. Did you also have any training on adults at risk at any point, or did you pick it up by going to the meetings?
I picked it up by going to the meetings.
Ms. Calver was asked about this. How were you instructing or guiding your staff to apply this policy? She said, as I said earlier, they have actually had training from Home Office on this policy, which I managed to get the majority of staff on. They're all sent the policy with clear instructions on what to raise as a vulnerable person. And a Part C would be opened if anyone came in claiming any of those conditions or reasons, and then they would be sent to Home Office if they weren't already declared as an adult at risk. Do you remember attending any training, any such training?
No.
And the purpose of adult at risk, and its working presumption, if you understand, is to avoid detention in those who are at particular risk, to identify people who'd be vulnerable to harm if they were detained, and therefore consider whether they should be detained. And this reflects, doesn't it, that for some people at least detention isn't a safer place.
Yes.
Going back to D1527 again, I want to ask you about an incident that happened on the 4th of May 2017, and this is when he accessed the netting. You cover this in your second statement at pages 18 to 19, paragraphs 83 to 91. And as you say in your statement, he jumped onto the netting. He's provided a statement to the inquiry, and we of course, have also seen the footage of this incident. It's also considered in a number of expert reports, but we'd like to hear your account of it. Did you see D1527 with a piece of broken plate threatening to harm himself?
Yes.
And you saw him having jumped on the netting?
Yes.
He was then removed by force under Rule 40 and taken to...
I think he got off the netting of his own accord.
Sorry. Yeah, I am skipping forward. Sorry. He did
sorry.
get off. No,
Yeah.
it's my fault. He was persuaded, I think, to go into a friend's room. And then from that room, he was removed under Rule 40. Yes, you're completely correct. You were asked about a comment you're recorded as having made before he was removed to E-Wing, but after he'd left the netting. And I think you've seen the footage and you've helpfully identified yourself as staff of 15 on that transcript. I won't ask for it to be shown, but just for the note, it's TRN 0000005, page 7. It's very short. You say, if he didn't have to do the washing up, he didn't have to go that far, did he? I don't know. And then there's laughter. It's a dirty plate. And I understand from your statement that you accept that you said that.
Yes.
And you say your statement at page 19, paragraph 91, I did think that this particular incident was about nothing more than a dirty plate. D1537, you mean D1527, was a highly stressed individual. It didn't take much to upset him. He's not just stressed, is he? He's got PTSD and
Yes.
is a survivor of torture.
Yeah.
And even if he was, in your words, easily upset or it didn't take much to upset him, it's still something that should be taken seriously, isn't it? And it might be a sign of his increasing vulnerability. Do you think the comment you made on the footage was inappropriate?
Yes.
And you were, as you said, his point of contact. You may have been the person who knew best his history of suicidal intentions. You say in your statement that you can't recall why you were on the wing that day, but you happened to be there or you were there when the incident happened.
Yeah, I maybe have been doing a review or something with the Oscar one at the time, and the call would have come through and we would have both gone.
We have a use of force form for the subsequent removal from association. Again, I won't ask for it to be shown unless you tell me you'd like to see it. It's CJS 005530 though, and it states at page 5 that you were present throughout, so there's a box where it says healthcare present throughout, it's ticked and it says you. And in your first witness statement, you said that you always completed a use of force form when present during the use of force against detainees. Do you mean a use of force form as in the sort of narrative that says what happened, or are you referring to an injury to detainee form?
There were 2 forms. I only ever did 2, I think. There was the one that you've got a copy of, and there was another form that we used to give to the Oscar one. I can't remember what the number
I'm just going to
was.
bring it up on the screen, and if you can't remember filling in one, you tell us, but it might just help you to look at one. It's CJS 005530. And if you go to page 5, so we can see it says there, name of healthcare member Kay Churcher, that's you, grade RMN, and it says at the top of the form there was a member of healthcare present throughout the incident, and it's ticked yes. If you just go on to page 8 or 9 or just further in the document, I just want to show you, so this is an example of Mr. Dix's account. So he's kind of set out a narrative account with his job.
No, I don't think we used to fill one of those out.
You don't remember filling in an account that talks about who was there and what happened and what you saw?
No, I don't remember.
Can we go to the last 2 pages? So I can't remember how many pages there are in the document, sorry, but yes, lovely. Go up to the top of that.
That's the bit.
So this is an injury to detainee form. This doesn't talk necessarily about the actions that happened. It talks about the injury afterwards. So as far as you remember, with regard to use of force, either on this event or generally, would you only fill in the injury to detainee form and not any other description of the force?
I think so.
And then you mentioned there's another form that can be removed from the screen now. Thank you. There was obviously, as I said, a decision to remove D1527 from association under Rule 40. G4S policy says that detainees who are located in the CSU under Rule 40 will be assessed by healthcare within 2 hours of placement there, and the healthcare members of staff will confirm the detainee's suitability to be placed into care and separation. Was that the policy you understood at the time?
Yes.
Did you complete a removal from association initial health assessment on this occasion?
I think my colleague did. I was supposed to have finished work, so I think my colleague did that one. She was the
So
general
you might have handed over to somebody else to do it.
Yeah.
And I think you suggest in your witness statement that you would often do them, but they would sometimes go missing.
Yes, yeah, we had a bit of an issue with the forms going missing, so we then started photocopying them and keeping one on our records as well as passing them to Oscar One.
And before you started that process, would you fill them in sort of handwriting normally,
Yes,
rather than type them up?
yeah,
And where would you leave them?
in the Oscar One office.
In E-Wing?
No, it was the officer in charge for the shift had an office at the back of healthcare.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
It's a central office for all of the wing.
Yes.
Fine. Okay. I would like to move on then to a different individual. This is D801. This is a gentleman who arrived at Brook House on the 1st of March 2017 from the community. And to give a bit of background, if we can have on the screen INQ 000112. This is a report done by the expert to the inquiry, one of the experts to the inquiry, Dr. Hard. And can we have the bottom of page 41 on the screen, please? So D801, as we can see, is considered there by Dr. Hard. He says the System 1 record, so that's the kind of healthcare electronic records, record for D801 indicate that he arrived at Brook House on the 1st of March 2017. An assessment conducted by healthcare assistant Evan Owens on the 1st of March 2017 indicated that he had previously been diagnosed with PTSD as a result of being a victim torture and ACDT open due to increased risk of self-harm, and the plan recorded by Evan Owens included referral to the GP and the mental health team. And we have the note of that initial assessment, which also refers to 2 previous overdoses. So before I ask you any specific questions as far as you can help us with regard to this, can I ask you about PTSD generally? I think you said it was something that you saw more frequently in the Brook House population than, of course, in the normal population, in the general population. And was it usually related to a history of torture?
No, it was related to a lot of things. I can remember there was a detainee that had suffered PTSD because he was actually in one of the boats that capsized coming across the channel.
Yeah.
And
I referred also to somebody who had combat stress-related PTSD as well. Yeah. Are you aware of the NICE clinical guideline 26 on post-traumatic stress disorder?
I've read it in the past.
I'm not going to test you on it. It's cited in the statement of Dr. Bingham, and I wonder if we could have that on screen. It's BHM 000033, page 13 at the bottom. So she sets out some parts of the guidelines, and I'll just ask for you to comment on them as far as you can in relation to Brook House. Yeah, bottom of page 13, please. So she says, the NICE guidelines 2005 on the management of PTSD in adults and children in primary and secondary care, which are applicable for the inquiry's relevant period, highlighted the importance of considering the possibility of PTSD in refugees and asylum seekers, given the likely prevalence of the condition within this population. And do you agree it's important to consider the possibility of it, given the cohort? Yeah. As you say, not just torture, but things like being on boats.
Yeah.
And overleaf at the top of 14. PTSD can present with a range of symptoms in adults, which in adults are most commonly in the form of very vivid, distressing memories of the event or flashbacks, otherwise known as intrusive or re-experiencing symptoms. However, at times, the most prominent symptoms may be avoidance of trauma-related situations or general social contacts. It is important when recognising and identifying PTSD to ask specific questions in a sensitive manner about both the symptoms and traumatic experiences. And she says that the NICE guidelines are drafted with primary care clinical settings in mind, and to consider GPs to be in a position to assess for or recognise and act on of symptoms of PTSD and act on, symptoms of PTSD. Indeed, the guidance states general practitioners and other members of the primary care team should be aware of traumas associated with the development of PTSD, and where people are present in primary care, GPs should take responsibility for the initial assessment and the initial coordination of care. Did you consider that during the relevant period you were adequately aware of the traumas that were associated with PTSD symptoms?
Yes.
And what about treatments for PTSD? Were you aware of what treatments, for example, had been shown to be effective?
Yes.
Were the GPs that you worked with, in your view, aware of noticing and acting on PTSD?
I think it's unfair of me to comment on that. I don't know. I don't know what their knowledge is.
Are you not commenting because you think it's unfair, or not commenting because you don't know?
I don't know what their knowledge was.
We can ask them about that. Yeah. Obviously, in the case that we were just looking at, D801, he has arrived with a diagnosis of PTSD, and it's said to be associated with trauma. So it's not a question here of diagnosing it. We already have the diagnosis. So moving down to page 15 of the document we're now on, last paragraph, paragraph 53. Even in cases in which symptoms of PTSD and associated distress have been identified, often a prescription of an antidepressant is issued in response. Whilst there is a role for medication in people who are unable to engage or do not wish to engage in psychological therapy, that cannot be the only course of treatment offered. However, the NICE clinical guidance is clear that drug treatments for PTSD should not be used as a routine first-line treatment for adults in general use or by specialist mental health professionals, in preference to a trauma-focused psychological therapy. And she says, thus, while prescribing medication gives the superficial appearance that a treatment has been given, in reality it deprives the person of the opportunity to access the most evidence-based treatment for their condition. That is, the treatment which is most likely to be effective. And do you accept, as the NICE guidance says here, that the most evidence-based treatment for PTSD is psychological therapy?
Yes.
Is it a particular type of psychological therapy or a suite?
No, it is a particular type of therapy.
Has it got a name?
Well, no, it's trauma therapy.
Yeah. And you say in your second statement at paragraph 31 that you had talking sessions at Brook House where detainees sometimes discuss their previous trauma, but you say you didn't really explore it because Brook House wasn't the environment to do that kind of thing. And is it fair to say that Brook House isn't the environment where it was possible or appropriate to give trauma-focused therapy?
Yes, definitely.
We were looking at D801's initial assessment, this noted his history of torture. So we were on, and if we can return to INQ 000112, this is Dr. Hard's report that summarises it. So page 41 had noted his history of torture, and if we can go to page 42, second paragraph. On the 2nd of March 2017 at 5:18, D801 was seen by consultant psychiatrist Dr. Belder along with RMN, and it says presumably you because the entry is in your name. Is that right? When we see an entry in the medical records that says Karen Churcher, even if the note then says Dr. Belder, is it because you both attended at the same time?
It was because he didn't have his own login at the time.
I see. So you'd write his name at the top of the entry, but yours would be in the sort of bar that you see.
He'd write the entry.
I see.
It'd just be under my name.
Did that mean that you were there, though?
Yes.
It says RMN.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Anne Beverley Baldwin, Deputy Director for Adult Services at SPFT. Dr. Belder noted in his consultation that D801 reported that he was severely tortured. Dr. Belder's plan included a Section 48 transfer to LGH and the commencement of metazapine 45 milligrams. Do you accept that in light of his being severely tortured, a Rule 35 appointment should have been made under Rule 35(3)?
Probably, but it was more important to get him his mental health treatment at the time. He was being transferred to a mental health hospital by the looks of it. So
there's a request, so that Section 48 is a request to transfer somebody for assessment or treatment at a mental health hospital. There's no reason, is there, why you can't have a request in the pipeline? I don't think it was done immediately. I know he was put on E-wing while that was processed, and eventually, in fact, as we may come to, the hospital didn't accept him under Rule 48, so he wasn't transferred. But there's no reason, is there, why you can't have one mind to treatment but also have to comply with Rule 35(3)?
No.
And it doesn't say in Rule 35(3) that something else should take precedence above it, or it's secondary.
No.
And as I said, he wasn't eventually accepted by the hospital. If it's you there and Dr. Belder and Beverley Baldwin, whose job, if any of you, out of the three of you, is it, when you hear about torture, to take the steps to ensure that a Rule 35 appointment is made?
Well, in that case, because the Section 48 was applied for, one of the GPs would have had to written a report as well, so they would have been aware of it, so I would have presumed that they would have taken it up.
So do you rely on the GP reading the full note and ascertaining for themselves there's a history of torture, I will make a Rule 35 appointment?
They have to write a report for the Section 48.
The purpose of that report, though, is to ensure transfer to hospital under Section 48.
Yes.
It's not focused on the history of torture necessarily.
No.
That's something that the patient shared at that consultation. Is there potentially a risk, if it's not made explicit to the doctor, that they won't realise that the Rule 35(3) requirement is engaged?
Yes, there could be.
Dr. Hard goes on to say at the bottom of page 42, in my opinion, it is of particular note that neither Dr. Belder nor Dr. Chowdhury, who I think was the doctor who probably wrote the Rule 48, the Section 48 transfer, made reference to the need for provision of a Rule 35(3) report in respect of apparent history of torture in order to notify the Home Office of this history. And if we just leave that on screen, I think you'll be aware of Rule 35.3, which says that the medical practitioner shall report to the manager on the case of any detained person who he is concerned may be a victim of torture. Were you familiar with Rule 35.3 during the relevant period?
I don't think so, no.
When did you become familiar with it?
I don't remember it. I don't remember it.
Here we have somebody who, there's not just a concern that they may have been a victim of torture, but they've directly shared
Yes.
with the healthcare professionals they've been severely tortured. And having read the rule now, do you now agree that a Rule 35.3 assessment should have been done?
Yes.
It doesn't require severe torture, it just requires a risk of torture. I want to segue slightly and ask about another comment you've made in your statement. So we'll leave that on the screen, please. But while we're on Rule 35.3, you were asked about a different detained person, and it's page 14 of your second statement, paragraphs 61 to 62. You're asked about a detained person, and the document you're asked about is an ACDT. I'll just let you get there. It's, page 14 of statement 2. Okay, can you see that 61 to 62? You say, I've been asked to refer to document, and then you give the number, CJS 002083. You say that he disclosed witnessing torture in Afghanistan and confirmed he was suffering from flashbacks of redacted killing his family. I would have explored these disclosures with D526, otherwise I would not have been able to document it. We don't carry out therapy work on past events. As previously explained, Brook House is not the environment to process those types of things. We help with the here and now and taught the detainees through coping mechanisms, etc. I did not refer D526 for a referral because I did not do the Rule 35 referrals. At that point, if a detainee wanted a Rule 35 appointment, they had to ask an RGN. So you've said Brook House isn't the right environment to treat people with PTSD, which we just discussed already. And you didn't refer him for a referral because you didn't do Rule 35 referrals. You said to us before that you would have sometimes told detainees that they could have one.
Encouraged them to go and get one.
We don't see that in your notes in the ACDT. Is it possible that you didn't always tell detained people that they should seek a Rule 35 appointment?
No, I think I did. It was part of the, have you got a solicitor, have you applied for a Rule 35, and have you contacted medical justice though?
And you say that if a detainee wanted a Rule 35 appointment, they had to ask an RGN. Mm-hmm. Were you able to tell an RGN that you had a concern about somebody who had disclosed to you a history of torture?
I could tell them, I couldn't guarantee that they would make an appointment.
Is that the same for the detainee? You can tell them about Rule 35, but you couldn't guarantee that they would follow it? Or?
Yes.
Was Miss Calver aware that you yourself would not make Rule 35 appointments?
Yes.
So we had, while we're on that page, and I asked you before about Rule 35.2 as well. You said at paragraph 60, I cannot think of any situations where detainees were not referred to Rule 35 reports due to a lack of staff understanding. We discussed the case of D1527 who didn't have Rule 35.2 assessments. Do you now accept that there may have been cases where detainees...
Yes.
So we have Dr. Hard's report still on the screen, and I was asking you about D801. So at the very bottom of that page 42, the last line, furthermore, given the apparent concern raised by Dr. Belder that D801 required a transfer under Section 48 of the Mental Health Act, it is of particular note that neither Dr. Belder nor Dr. Chowdhury made reference to the need for the provision of a Rule 35.1 report, notifying the Home Office of any concerns in relation to continued detention on this occasion. So he's talking about the doctors and not about you. But I just want to ask you if you were aware of the provisions of Rule 35.1, and if not, I can read them to you and you can comment on them.
I am now.
Were you at the time?
No.
And Rule 35.1 says the medical practitioner shall report to the manager on the case of any detained person whose health is likely to be injuriously affected by continued detention or any conditions of detention. So that doesn't require, does it, a diagnosis of any particular medical condition
No.
or any sort of level of severity? All it requires is that someone's health is likely to be injuriously affected by continued detention or its conditions. And you said you weren't aware of that at the time.
No, as I say, I am now.
When did you become aware of it?
When I read it in this,
There's the,
this is the first time I've seen this act.
sorry, this is the first time I've seen this.
Seen this act.
Yeah.
I would have read policies and procedures, but in the evidence bundle is the first time I've seen that act.
You say you had Rule 35 training a year after you started at Brook House. Was that covered in the Rule 35 training?
I can't remember. I can't remember what was covered in the training. I know there were changes to the policy.
We can have a look at the training materials and we have those before us and we can obviously ask others about it. But is it fair to say that even if it was covered in the training, it wasn't something that then became part of your day-to-day practice such that you were applying it to your care of residents?
As I say, I learnt that I could do the Part Cs, which I did more of the Part Cs. But I would always refer people that I saw for a Rule 35 because I knew it was about medical conditions, so I'd refer them.
Well, you didn't refer 1D1527 for a Rule 35 2 appointment, for example, when he disclosed suicidal ideation to you, for example, at the end of April and on the 2nd of May. So it's not fair, is it, to say that you would always refer people for a Rule 35?
Well, no, I would suggest to them to have a Rule 35. I wouldn't keep suggesting. And I think that's what I initially would have suggested a Rule 35. I wouldn't have suggested to go and get another one.
So you would always, though, you say, suggest a Rule 35 to people. In the first instance, you just might not suggest it repeatedly. And in your view, did you always suggest a Rule 35 where you had concerns that somebody's health would be injuriously affected by detention? So the rule under Rule 35(1.
Yes, anyone that I saw that was referred to us, I would suggest a Rule 35.
In any situation?
Yes.
Even though you say you didn't understand what the precise meaning of the rules were?
No, I would refer because it was part of their way of getting hope, of seeking to be released.
We've heard the statistics of the number of Rule 35(1) and 2 reports that were done at Brook House during the relevant period. So as I said, no Rule 35(2) reports and very few Rule 35(1) reports. That is seemingly inconsistent with your suggestion that you referred lots and lots of patients to have Rule 35 assessments, not just in case of torture, but you say when you had any concerns. Do you have any explanation for how that gap came to be?
I didn't complete the Rule 35 reports. I can only send somebody for a Rule 35. I do my assessment, my evidence is there. I can't comment on what the doctors have done.
And is this something that, can you give any explanation for why you might not have consistently recorded in patients' records that you'd referred them for a Rule 35? It's fair, isn't it, to say that a Rule 35 is part of a plan, part of a treatment plan, perhaps? Yeah. Is there any reason why that wouldn't be referred to in your notes?
Sometimes the notes would have been rushed, to be honest. There was no gap between appointments, so sometimes the notes would have been rushed.
So going back to 801, you and your mental health colleagues, Ms Dowd and Mr Newland, were involved in his ongoing care. Can we have HOM 032191 on the screen, please? And page 3 of that. So that long entry that we have there is the one that was already summarised in Dr. Hard's report, which notes his history of saying, again, it's your name at the top, but it says Dr. Belder, which means that he used your account, but you were there. And it's ended by noting he has had 2 suicide attempts. He tried to disguise the intentions and did not admit that he took 2 overdoses with suicidal intention. He was admitted to ESH and received treatment. And we see them from his records as they're ongoing. I won't take you to all of them, but we have them here. That he has mental health team involvement daily or almost daily, and this is by way of ACDT reviews with not always you, members of your team as well. If we go to page 5, there's an entry by James Newland about 2/3 of the way down the page. Yeah. So James Newland's entry is the big one, and it's the 4th paragraph down. In terms of risk, there is a potential risk for self-harm, and he's denied being suicidal, and diagnosis there is PTSD, which is noted. So he's denied being suicidal, but it's relevant, is it, you help us with this, that there's 2 suicide attempts which he'd already denied. So as we saw on the longer note on page 3, there was a history of 2...
That entry's by Dr. Belder.
Oh, sorry, yes, you're right. It's the same issue as before, isn't it? James Newland's name is on there, but Dr. Belder didn't do the... didn't have a login, as you say. Yeah, thank you for that. So that's Dr. Belder's entry. So there's he's denied being suicidal, but it's possible, isn't it, that people can deny being suicidal, yes, but they are truly suicidal. Yeah. And particularly so if you hear that this person has denied 2 previous overdose attempts, which you know in fact did happen. So Dr. Belder says there's a potential risk of self-harm. He notes the PTSD. And in fact, in relation to this detainee, no Rule 35 is still done. And you'd accept, given the provisions of Rule 35, well, 1, 2 and 3, that he should have had a Rule 35 assessment at this point.
Yes, yes.
ACDT observations continue. And would you agree with me that ACDT, while it's monitoring, isn't in itself a form of treatment?
No, definitely not.
And you say in your statement at paragraph 20 that you didn't have any ACD training until a year after you started at Brook House. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you consider your role in ACDTs to be active or passive? Were you...
Active.
What were you doing at ACDT reviews?
On a mental health nurse point of view,
yeah,
I was doing my own personal assessment.
Mm-hmm.
During the review, it was a holistic review, really, trying to find out what was going on, what had been, if anything had been improved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it was really important that we were there.
But it's, as you say, monitoring. It's not treatment, it's rather monitoring. So you're taking a note of what's going on, but you're not...
Yeah, it's like a risk assessment.
Okay, thanks. And then going back to D801, can I ask to show you the last entry on page 7? So this is an entry not by you, but by Ms. Dowd. She's also a registered mental health nurse, isn't she? And again, it's actually Dr. Belder who the note is made by, it looks like, History Dr. Belder. And it says, plan, this is a less than ideal placement for him as he needs intensive trauma therapy. Ideally, he should be bailed and receive psychological therapy in the community. So that's not, you weren't there, that's Dr. Belder's view. Did you know that that was his view at the time, or can't you remember in relation to this individual?
I can't remember, sorry.
If you had known that the Dr. Belder took that view, would you agree, or do you agree now that you can't have intensive trauma therapy at Brook House, and you need to have that in the community? Then on page 8, we have 19th of March 2017 entry by Ms. Dowd. Top one there on the page, saw D801 in the morning on E-Wing, room 4. He was placed on constant supervision after a ligature was found around his neck last night. He refused medication, refused to eat, refused RMN support. And at the bottom of page 8 there, you see him, history RMN, spoke after review and discussed the use of rubber bands for the relief of stress, showed how to use. discussed his reasons for self-harm and other coping mechanisms. He feels safe in the environment and finds the fear of moving overwhelming at times. And the plan is to continue with RMN and psychiatric support. Dr. Bingham says in her statement, it's page 23, but I'll just read it out so you can leave this on the screen. It's paragraph 68. In several of the cases that I've reviewed, detainees were noted as being advised by a nurse to use elastic bands around their wrists to help with thoughts of self-harming. This is, at best, a harm reduction approach through a less dangerous means of self-inflicting pain. It doesn't address or treat the underlying cause, be it distress, unmanageable symptoms, lack of coping mechanisms, or other mental health issues. To provide this without other intervention to mitigate the distress shows a focus purely on risk management and not on therapeutic care. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
There needed to be an urgent consideration of this man's safety, didn't there?
Yes.
And of his suitability for detention.
Yes.
And the Home Office needed to know what was going on. And the final entry I wanted to ask about in relation to this man is at page 9, 1/3 of the way down the page. Again, it's a note with your name on it, but as you've helped us with, made by Dr. Belder. Seen with RMN, I've been informed that over the weekend he put a ligature around his neck. So the ligature incident is noted. It's noted that he didn't want to talk about it. And again, he denied self-harm intention. And it says on the 4th from bottom line, he has been in contact with his solicitor, but has not news about bail. The plan is EDMR plus trauma therapy are evidence-based interventions of the treatment of his condition, but they cannot be applied at Brook House. He will continue to have regular sessions with the RMN. And you've helped us with that. Evidence-based interventions means actual treatment for his PTSD.
Yes.
And he's not having any such treatment at Brook House.
No.
Would you agree, given his suicide attempt in particular, that he is someone who is likely to be injuriously affected by being in detention?
Yes.
Including because his condition can't be treated in detention?
Yes.
So that's potentially engaging Rule 35(1), as you now understand it. There's clearly suicidal intentions, so that's Rule 35(2). And there's a history of torture in his case as well, which obviously engages the third limb of Rule 35. From the moment he entered Brook House, these considerations, or any of them, should have given rise to a Rule 35 assessment.
Yes.
But instead of consideration of Rule 35, he's being managed on ACDT, which you tell us is more of a risk assessment than treatment. And it doesn't prevent deterioration, does it?
No.
Eventually, a Rule 35(1) was done, not until the 3rd of April 2017, so over a month after he arrived. This recorded the severe PTSD, which of course had been present throughout and was noted initially. And the inability to treat for this while at Brook House was effectively the reason for releasing him, which of course had always been the case. He was then immediately released. Would you say that in hindsight, with regard to this man's care, as much as you've been able to remind yourself of it, there was a failure to do Rule 35, which gave him insufficient care,
Yes.
and it potentially caused harm to him?
Yes.
I want to move on now to D643 briefly. You can take that off the screen. Thank you, evidence handler. The inquiries heard evidence from D643, and I mentioned him before when I was talking about Induction. So he's the ex-serviceman who was diagnosed with severe combat PTSD. That diagnosis had been made before he came to Brook House, and as I said, I already asked you about him. He'd been attending the emotional support group, but he found that it exacerbated his mental ill health, listening to other detainees' issues. And he said that a lot of what was discussed at the emotional support group was people with concerns about their immigration status. Did you ever attend those groups?
A few, yes, I did. But yeah, that was one of the things.
And it's not, is it a PTSD treatment either?
No.
Your note in his medical records, which is set out in his statement, which you have at tab 7, but it's just a short note, but it's at page 10 of his statement. I'll read it out for you. It says, he expressed he was unwilling to attend emotional groups as he feels there's nothing that will benefit from the group. And you say he appears disinterested and dismissive of the techniques taught, unwilling to take ownership for his mental well-being, however, reluctant to accept or use techniques taught to him by the team. So, as you've said, the emotional support group isn't PTSD treatment. Might it be even an inappropriate environment for someone with complex PTSD needs?
No, I wouldn't say so. It was based on CBT, which is part of trauma therapy.
So not inappropriate, but also not aimed at his condition.
Some people just don't like groups either. They prefer a one-to-one.
And you say there's techniques taught here, but the techniques taught at the group obviously wouldn't be aimed at PTSD specifically. No. And there are, as you've accepted, no PTSD therapies available at Brook House. While at Brook House, he did repeatedly ask for specialist help for PTSD suffering, because he'd received this in the past from sort of veterans charities. Would you say in hindsight it might be unfair to record that somebody who says that the specific support offered, the emotional health group, isn't helping him, is unwilling to take ownership for his mental well-being?
He was also offered one-to-one sessions.
Would they have been focused on his PTSD?
They would have been giving him like grounding techniques and things like that, yes.
Who would have done those?
We would have, but they weren't PTSD trauma therapy, no.
Yeah. I'm going to ask then about D1275. I'm just looking at the time, Chair. It's 11:30. I propose that we, as we started a bit late, carry on with this witness, hopefully until the break, and then we can have a break after this witness and before the next witness. But I wanted to give a heads up about that. So going on to 1275 then. By way of background, this was a detained man who was shown on Panorama. He's shown on the 14th of June 2017 having taken spice and being on the ground. I presume you watched Panorama.
Yes.
And he's being mocked by officers. Can we see on the screen, please, BHM 000033, page 102, from about halfway down the page. And again, this is an extract from Dr. Bingham's statement, but it sets out in summary D1275's engagement with mental health and healthcare while at Brook House. Obviously under the title, Medical and Other Records from Brook House. So the first engagement is there, 1/5/2017. A nurse claims mental health issues, states he hears voices. Unclear whether detainee has been a victim of torture. Repeated they will find me on admission. Would not elaborate on who he was referring to or what would happen if they found him. Referred to RMN. Vague and misleading with answers on admission. And we see from the penultimate paragraph there, 9th of the 5th, 17, 17th of the 5th, 17, and 18th of the 5th, 17, did not attend RMN appointments and so was released from the caseload. And it says Karen Churcher and Dahlia Dowd involved in the decision to discharge. There's then an entry where he's taking spice at the bottom of the page. Then there's the event that's shown on Panorama, as I said, on the 14th of June, where he takes spice and the officers see him. And there is, I should also add, an SIR from the wing that's dated the 22nd of June 2017, which suggests that he may have been used as a guinea pig to take spice. If we go over to 104, please. There's a record on the 23rd of August. So, yes, there we go, up, of odd behaviour. And believing that people were taking his photo throughout the centre, keeps looking to the fire door and saying, what's that, who's there? It's because I'm famous and they want to take my photo, so possible visual hallucinations. And then from 27th of the 9th, 17, MDT discussion recorded by GP Dr. Uzerali, difficulty engaging, concern regarding safeguarding and difficulty learning. Karen says that she will try to engage in the next week to make assessment. And after that entry, as Dr. Bingham notes, it appears he wasn't seen until the 17th of January 2018, because on the 16th of December 2017, he didn't attend an RMN appointment. Christmas Eve 2017, didn't attend an RMN appointment. Discharged from mental health team caseload. Planned for him to re-refer himself should he wish to engage in the future. 17th of January 18, he's noted to be talking to himself, spoken to RMN, who were advised to make a referral for him. And then on the 21st and the 25th of January 2018, he did not attend RMN. And on the 25th of January 2018, the RMN wrote, "This is now the 13th appointment offered and not attended. This equates to 130 hours offered. He has been shown where to attend and has been given various prompts and reminders to attend, however, without success. Therefore, discharged from mental health service." In your second statement at paragraph 34, Ms. Church, you said that mental health services completely relied on detainees being candid about their problems in order to receive correct treatment.
Yes.
Would you accept that some of the people who might most need help from healthcare do not seek it themselves?
Not necessarily.
Sometimes
Sometimes, yes.
they might not attend due to their own condition,
Yeah,
possible
sometimes.
paranoia,
Yeah.
or a lack of understanding that they need help or that something might help them.
Yes.
Also possibly due to drugs or external pressure from other people. There's various reasons. Now, I understand that you say at paragraph 39 it's not your job specifically to deal with spice, but drug taking might, I suppose, be relevant to your role if there's a concern about drug-induced psychosis or something like that.
Yes, yes.
And in any event, as I said, there's a variety of reasons that people might not attend. Do you agree then there's a need for proactive identification and monitoring?
Yes, yeah, but we could only do so much. If somebody refuses to, if you're face to face with somebody, you found them and they still refuse to engage with you.
So he's discharged a number of times due to non-attendance. Should there be a record, ideally, even if there wasn't actually, of where his reasons for non-attendance or what you thought his reasons were should be set out?
Yes, yeah, would be helpful.
Would it be helpful to have a conversation with wing staff to understand, whether they had any insight into why he wasn't coming to healthcare?
Yes, yeah.
Were there any processes in place to check why someone like this gentleman would not be attending, especially if they'd been identified as needing support from the mental health department?
Yes, often we'd try and find them.
Yeah.
We'd go and try and find them in the unit.
Would you always have time or capacity to do that, or would you do it when you could?
Not always.
So the issue of mental capacity has been raised in relation to this individual, D1275. He was hospitalised eventually under the Mental Health Act after he was released from detention, and he ended up being treated in hospital for several months. He was seen by a number of specialists, and their reports are summarised in Dr. Bingham's statement, but in brief he was noted later to suffer from bipolar affective or schizoaffective disorder, and was assessed to lack insight into medication and why he was on it, and to lack capacity to consent to treatment, along with other things. So obviously you can lack capacity for certain things and not others. It's a dynamic assessment. Were you qualified to assess mental capacity under the Mental Capacity Act? Or did you
The
be able
doctor should do that, yes.
Is it your role or the doctor's role to do mental capacity assessments?
The doctor.
And
We
would
can
that
advise, but
would that be Dr. Belder, the psychiatrist, or any of the GPs?
no, any of the GPs.
And do you recall, and tell us if you can't remember in relation to this detainee, whether a capacity assessment should be done?
I can't recall, sorry.
That's fine. Looking back now at his repeated non-attendance, as well as obviously the slightly bizarre statements he makes, do you think he is probably someone who should have had a mental capacity assessment?
I can't comment. I don't believe I ever had a conversation with him, so...
That's right. You discharged him from the mental health caseload, but I'm not sure that you saw him yourself. Was that in itself a concern, that you're discharging someone who you haven't yourself had a chance to speak to and to get a feeling for their condition?
Well, there wasn't just me, so
Sure.
I don't know whether my colleagues did or not.
In her evidence to the inquiry, Miss Calver was asked about this individual as well. She accepted that he shouldn't have been removed from the team's caseload and said that mental health team should have gone to the wings to check why he hadn't attended appointments. And do you agree if that wasn't done, it should have been done?
Yeah, we would have done it.
Would you have made a note of doing so?
Not always, no.
She said that he should not have been discharged from the caseload. Do you agree with that?
In hindsight, yes, but we could only hold so many on our caseload, otherwise we wouldn't get to see anybody new coming in.
And was that kind of a number that you had in mind, or did it depend on the complexity of the cases that you had in front of you?
It depended on the complexity.
So would you say, is it fair to say that there were times at Brook House where there were people who, if there'd have been a different month, they would have been on your caseload, but because of the situation you're in, weren't?
We would always see everybody. It was the amount of sessions or the length in between each session that might have altered.
But it's not right to say you would have seen everybody because you didn't see this gentleman, for example.
No, everybody that presented that we could find.
So there might be people who you would push harder to follow up if you had the time to do so, but you didn't always have that time.
Yes.
She was also asked about a security report which mentioned that he might not have capacity to understand and attend appointments. That was a wing report, which apparently didn't reach healthcare. And she said that that should have reached healthcare. Is that something that would have been relevant for you to see?
Yes.
And she was asked whether there was a serious omission in his case because the system operating failed to safeguard him. And you said, with hindsight, I believe, do you agree with that, with the benefit of hindsight?
Yes.
I want to ask now about a different detainee, so you can take that down from the screen, please. This is D687. Again, he's a gentleman who was featured on the Panorama programme. He's given evidence to the inquiry in form of a statement which has been read on his behalf. And he's shown on Panorama. He's in a toilet cubicle with a ligature around his neck. He's talking of killing himself, and then he's restrained by some officers. He was referred to mental health on the 17th of February 2017 following a suggestion by the clinical lead. He didn't attend appointments on the 25th of February or the 1st of March, but he did then attend on the 7th of March. It was Miss Dowd who saw him and not you. And he's noted by Miss Dowd to be very tearful and anxious. He talks of an assault against him in the past, but he's quite reluctant to share the details of that. And did you find that people don't always share exactly the same information at every consultation? Sometimes they might be more forthcoming and sometimes less so.
Yes, and I think sometimes they want to discuss one particular thing. And
He then returns to non-attendance on the 14th and the 20th and the 22nd of March. And the latter two were scheduled to be with you, but he didn't attend, and therefore he was discharged from mental health as well. He was referred, or he self-referred back to mental health on the 23rd of March 2017. There's a record of a referral form, but there's no further appointment, and then he self-harmed on the 13th of April with a cut to his arm. He's seen by Dr. Israeli, who prepares a Rule 35 report 2 days later. Dr. Hard has considered his case generally, and he says at 5.181 of his first report that there was sufficient evidence within the System 1 records that his mental health was deteriorating. So would you agree that, and it wasn't to you, but there was a significant disclosure in that appointment where he talked of his history of abuse and that he was reluctant to share that?
yes.
And given that that was followed by his missing appointments, could or should he have been encouraged to attend?
If we had found him, yes.
His records do show 2 entries about his attendance at an emotional health group, and we've already discussed what those are. And at that group, he described suicidal intentions, and therefore he was referred to Oscar 1, presumably to open an ACDT. But in fact, no ACDT was opened, and no referral for Rule 35 assessment was made. Now, if you weren't at this emotional health group, would you or your team expect to receive information about things like that if they were shared at emotional health groups?
Yes, because one of the team would sit in on
Right.
that group.
And in particular, information like suicidal intentions being shared. And if that information was shared and someone from your team was there, there should have been some action, do you agree, in relation to that?
Yes. Yeah.
And obviously there was a decision to place him on ACDT, although he wasn't. But do you accept now that he should have also been referred for a Rule 35 report?
Yes.
And to continue with his care, he was placed on an ACDT then on the 5th of May 2017 after saying he was going to take an overdose. I think you attended the ACDT reviews, and you've already said that a Rule 35-1 should have been done. Again, he's expressed a desire to take an overdose, so again, the rule is engaged. And then there's the event that I mentioned was shown on Panorama, where he is in the toilet with a ligature around his neck. So, in summary, I want to ask whether, although you've sort of covered it already with your answers to my questions, do you now consider, in hindsight, in light of his comments about suicidal intentions and the disclosures he's made, that he should have been managed differently?
Yes.
And differently how?
That the Rule 35 should have been completed earlier.
That's all I wanted to ask you about specific individuals. I have a few other questions, but they won't take too long. The first is a specific question about medical justice. Mm-hmm. So you referred to them already. You said that you told detainees about them. And you said at paragraph 50 of your second statement, and you may wish to turn to that. I'm afraid I didn't make a note of the page it's on. It's page... oh, no, it's your first statement, sorry, paragraph 50. It's the bottom of page 7 of your first statement. It starts with, I have a vague recollection. And in summary, you say, you have a recollection of raising an issue with your Home Office about medical justice, medico-legal reports, specifically that you'd seen 3 reports about 3 detainees and they were all identical. And you say you raised this with the Home Office. Now, we haven't been provided with any documents that record that being raised. Do you recall whether you mentioned this to, or would have mentioned it to Miss Calver as well?
Yes, I would have.
So Teresa Schleicher from, and I apologise to her for how I said her name, which is probably wrong, from Medical Justice, has considered this, your account of this, and responded to it within her own statement. So in fairness to both of you, I want to read you her response, and you can comment on it. She says, and her statement references BHM 000031. I don't need it on screen, though. She says at paragraph 18, I was shocked by this allegation, which if true would be a very serious one, especially if a doctor produces an MLR, medico-legal report, without seeing the client. Ms Churcher does not name the medical justice doctor who is alleged to have done so or give any indication of when this happened. However, I've investigated this allegation by looking back at our log of complaints, not limited to the relevant period, but for the whole time I've been a caseworker, so since 2009. I cannot see that there's been any complaints brought to our attention of this nature from Brook House, another IRC, or by the Home Office. I note that Ms Churcher says that this issue was escalated to a senior manager and then the Home Office, and she says that you don't name who that was. It surprises me if it was serious enough that a senior manager was involved, as well as the Home Office, that Medical Justice was not approached about these concerns at all, or that this issue had been mentioned by other G4S healthcare witnesses. And she goes on to say that there's a clear process for the production of a medico-legal report, including a rigorous peer review process before it gets sent out to an organisation, including to a detainee, that they're all reviewed in draft form. And she goes on to talk about the experience of the clinical reviewing team, and that the reviewer would be expected to look at medical documents alongside the report as a minimum. Is it possible, given the passage of time, and I know you say at paragraph 50 that you have a vague recollection, that it may not have been Medical Justice but may have been a different organisation who had these concerns in relation to?
It is possible, but I assumed Medical Justice were the people that were compiling the reports.
Did you assume every time you saw a medico-legal report that obviously wasn't done by one of the GPs at Brook House, but a separate medico-legal report, that it was from Medical Justice?
Yes. So I'm...
Fine. I lastly wanted to ask you about some comments that you made which are shown on Callum Tully's recordings. And you've helped us by watching the videos of them and identifying yourself in them. So can I turn to TRN 0000094, page 25, please? And this is a transcription of a clip taken on the 6th of July 2017, in which Michelle Brown is discussing... Can I have just the whole page, because there's some footnotes I need to look at? Thank you. Oh, no, it's really small, that's fine. Michelle Brown is talking about releasing somebody into the community, and then you see additional text 1's been added, and she says there's a bigger risk of just releasing you into the community. She's explaining in summary to D2728 that a judge reviewing his bail application may take the view that there's a bigger risk of releasing him into the community, and she mentions that that's because at Brook House they have 24-hour care. Was it your understanding that detainees might be unlikely to get bail if they were suffering serious mental health issues because Brook House was safer than the community?
Yes.
And did you ever tell detainees this?
Yeah, it's already
We've seen-
judgment, yeah.
And you were there when people like Michelle Brown might have been telling detainees this, and you wouldn't have necessarily corrected her because your understanding was that it was true.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Go to page 27, please. Thank you. Again, this is D2728 being discussed. And Michelle Brown gives her assessment at the top. So Michelle Brown was the head of security at the time, I understand. She gives her assessment of the detainee's risk of suicide. She says he gets reassurance he'll go on medication or something, but I don't think between here and a doctor, he's not going to kill himself because he wants to get the doctor to look. He's not in crisis. She asks, do we agree? And a male manager says, yeah. And Callum Tully doesn't disagree. And then she says at 1049, okay, so are we agreed that he's not going to kill himself between now and seeing the doctor? And the male manager and Callum Tully both agree. You didn't respond to this. Do you recall why you didn't or wouldn't have responded?
Was that me?
Sorry, it's Michelle Brown.
Yeah, no, was it?
You were present, I understand.
Was I?
I believe so.
I haven't seen that.
Oh, okay, fine. Can I ask you, and I apologise if we may have missed sending a clip to you. We'll review it and see whether or not you were there, and we can ask you to confirm that if we find it to be necessary. If you had been present and Michelle Brown had been giving a view on somebody's suicidal risk, firstly, would you have offered a view?
Yes.
And do you consider that it's appropriate for the head of security to be giving such a view?
No, it's not her decision.
Thank you. And can we go to clip 5? Michelle Brown, so you are present for this one. We've had to add your name in because you were attributed to the wrong name, but then you helped us with who's who. Michelle Brown says at the top, that's why we just need a presence when the doctor does have the conversation with him, because we can assess it then. Does that make sense?
I haven't seen that clip either.
You haven't seen this one either? Okay, I apologise, Miss Churcher.
I got sent 2 clips.
Fine. I think possibly the fairest and best way to do this, as it's just one sort of question about a clip, and I would like to give you the opportunity to view it, is that if we decide that it's necessary for this witness to be asked the question about the clip, we give her access to it and ask for a very short comment on whether it's you and any follow-up questions. Is that something you'd be...
Yes.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Feels fair. Thank you.
And that was the last thing I was going to ask you about. So thanks for confirming that you hadn't seen that. We may follow that up with you. You can take that off the screen now. That was the end of my questions for you, Miss Churcher. The chair may have some questions for you now.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms Moore. Thank you, Ms Churcher. I do just have one question. We've heard from some other non-medically trained witnesses about the impact that they felt dealing with traumatic incidents had on them. And by traumatic incidents, I'm including people who've referred to use of force, self-harm, drug use, violence between individuals on the units themselves. As somebody who is a mental health professional and who worked on the wings, do you have any observations that you can share about the impact that you observed on non-medical staff during or after those incidents?
Yes, that they weren't offered support. There was no welfare officer. There was nowhere for them to go to get sort of any de-escalation from an incident. They weren't given time just to sort of express. It was quite a macho environment, so sometimes they would come in to us and just sit down and say, and offload a little bit, but there was nowhere officially for them to get support on site.
Did that concern you?
Yes.
Do you remember whether you raised that concern with anybody?
Probably on a very informal basis, but yeah, I think it's important to everyone's mental well-being to be able to discuss what goes on and sort of internalise it, really.
So I just want to make sure I've understood what you're telling me correctly. So in your experience, you may have done kind of informal debriefs, what we might term clinical supervision in a different setting with individuals, but that wasn't a formalised process.
No, and that was only if they came to us. Occasionally, if there was an incident, we would say a quick, are you okay? You know, if you want to come and talk, come and talk. But that wasn't part of our role.
Did you have clinical supervision as part of your role?
I did, yes. Yeah, I had mine externally. Yes, I'm a great believer in clinical supervision.
Okay, thank you. So there was no care team as such, debrief team who had a specific role at the time that you were at Brook House? Thank you. That's very helpful. I have no other questions for you, Ms Churcher. I know it's been a little bit of a stop-starty morning, and my apologies for that, but it's been very important to hear evidence, so thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So it's just before 5 to 12. I suggest that we return at 10:12 for the evidence of Miss Williams.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ledger. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The witness is Chrissy Williams.
Thank you.
Would you like to read after me?
I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Okay.
Thank you. Could you give your full name?
I'm Christine Williams.
You've made a statement for the inquiry, which is at DWF 4020. I'm not going to take you through all of that statement because I'll ask that it's adduced into evidence in full, which means it stands as your evidence, so I don't need to ask you about everything in it.
Okay.
So I'm just going to ask you about some particular topics that are relevant to your role.
Okay.
So in your statement, you say that you qualified as a nurse in November 1976. Was that as a general nurse?
Yeah.
You worked at Crawley Hospital until 1983 and then in a hospice setting in palliative care for 25 years, followed by a nursing home for 1 year and back to palliative care for 2 more years. Those seem to be quite different settings to Brook House. How did those roles prepare you for the work you did at Brook House?
A&E, when I was working in the A&E department, that helped me towards the emergency side of things. Palliative care, probably because I had a lot of input with bereavement and people that were looking at being needed support. So that probably to help when I had patients at Brook House.
At paragraph 3, you say you started at Brook House as a staff nurse in June 2011 and you were promoted to senior nurse after 2 years, so in 2013, and then you were promoted to clinical lead in September 2016, is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
What did the role of clinical lead entail?
That was looking after staff, the registered nurses, the RMNs, the nursing assistants, going liaising with them. They had home office and also liaising with senior management as well. So
You would supervise nurses and healthcare assistants, is that right?
that's right.
Did you also carry out clinical duties with patients yourself? Was it a clinical role as a nurse as well?
Sometimes if we were short staff, yeah.
You say that you left G4S in January 2018 and because you moved away, and after doing some agency work you retired in October 2021, is that right?
That's right.
So
yeah.
you're no longer working.
No.
I just want to ask you a little bit about the training you received at Brook House for your role. Did you receive control and restraint or use of force training?
Some, but not a lot. I did because, yeah.
And what did that training cover?
Just to, I think more for helping us to, when we were in a difficult situation, that was more that way than looking at the patient side of things.
So the training, did it cover an understanding that nurses were able to intervene to stop a use of force?
I think so. I can't remember, but I think it should have done, yes.
Did you understand that that was an important part of
Yes.
healthcare role?
Yeah.
In a use of force in particular?
We should be, yes, yeah.
Do you think that your staff understood that?
I hope so, but I can't call. No.
What steps did you take to satisfy yourself that they did understand?
I did speak to them and got them to come back to me if they were unsure of things. So I would talk to them about it.
Do you think there was enough training for healthcare staff in relation to use of force?
No.
No. Did that lead to a feeling that, and indeed a situation, that use of force was really entirely the remit of the detention staff?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think that led to nurses feeling reluctant to challenge detention staff
Possibly,
in
yeah.
relation to use of force? Possibly.
Yeah, possibly.
Have you ever intervened to stop a use of force in your time at Brook House?
I think I may have done once, yes.
In what type of situation?
They were using them, I know the patient was not, he was struggling and he couldn't breathe very well, so I stopped it because I was worried that they were cut. He was pushed down on the floor, so I was worried about him being suffocated, and so I stopped it straight away.
And did the detention staff
Yes,
stop?
Yeah, they did.
Were you aware of healthcare's role prior to a planned use of force in relation to safeguarding of the welfare of a detainee?
Yeah. Well, I can remember, yeah.
What did you see that role to be?
If we should have checked on the computer their medical notes to find out if they had any serious illnesses or that they were likely to affect them in or any injuries that they may have had, and then we would needed to, when we were at the meeting before then, we should have raised that to let them know.
So you would your role was to raise concerns with the detention staff who would be carrying out the use of force
Yes.
in advance of the use of force being done.
Yes.
Did you also understand that your role was to raise any contraindication to the use of force in the first place?
Sorry.
Did you understand that your role was also to raise any reasons why use of force shouldn't be used?
Yeah. Yeah.
And did you do that yourself?
Yeah.
Were you aware of your nursing staff doing so?
That was. I'm hoping they did, but I wasn't there when they were doing this.
So you're not sure that it was actually happening?
I know. It was,
part of your role as clinical lead was to review complaints from detainees about healthcare. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
How did you go about carrying out that role? Had you been trained to investigate complaints?
No, I haven't been trained, but my manager showed me what was expected of me to do.
And what was that?
That we took the complaints and we investigated the people that were involved in that complaint and asking questions, checking on their notes, and then we would write the letter to them after making. Sorry. We would write a letter to the
detainee with a response.
Yeah, yeah.
If you had a complaint about a particular staff member, would you always speak to the staff member who was the subject of the complaint?
Yes.
Would that be an informal conversation, or would you take a formal statement from them, a written statement?
More probably informal, but sometimes I would take a statement from them. Yeah.
Did it depend upon the nature of the complaint?
Yeah.
If it was a serious complaint, what would your process be?
I would take a statement from all the people who were involved, but then it would be handed up to NHS England to also take up that road to check it as well.
Would you also investigate complaints by detainees against GPs working in Brook House?
Yes.
And so it would cover all members of healthcare staff who are complained about?
Yes, yeah.
So you were essentially investigating your colleagues, is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Did that cause any particular problems?
Not that I was aware of, no.
And were you satisfied that you were independent in investigating complaints? You worked with
Yeah.
these people, you line managed some of them.
Yeah.
How did you go about ensuring that the complaints investigation process was independent?
I would explain to them that I was doing an investigation and that it was part of my role, so it was something I had to do.
Yes. In 2017, there were roughly 53 complaints in total that related to healthcare. 35 of those related to medication. So were you aware that medication complaints seemed to be a particular issue at the time?
Yes, I think, if I can recall, yes, I think I remember.
The types of complaint were that they had not been prescribed or weren't receiving prescribed medication, or were being prescribed the wrong medication or too weak medication, often complaints of simply being handed paracetamol, and that there were sometimes delays in receiving medication. Is that the sort of thing that you remember detainees complaining about?
Yes, I remember that.
That does seem to be a particular theme of the complaints. When you identified that there were a number of complaints about a particular issue, what would you do? What action would you take in relation to a trend?
I would try and find out why, especially with the medication, what was happening, why it was happening, and then raise it with my manager.
There were also, would you, when you had complaints from detainees, speak to the detainee themselves, or was it just the staff members?
Just staff members.
Why was that?
That was how I was taught what to do. I mean, occasionally I would probably speak to the detainees, but generally no.
There were also some complaints about the attitude of healthcare staff and in particular of GPs being rude or aggressive. Do you think there was any substance to complaints that detainees were being treated poorly by healthcare staff?
Not that I recall overall. Yes, there would be the odd complaint about them being rude, and I did bring it up with them that they should be respected and not rudeness didn't apply in healthcare at all.
The Shaw Review in 2016 commented that there was a culture of disbelief in healthcare in relation to complaints being raised by detainees. Is that something you recognised to be happening in 2017?
I don't remember, sorry.
Do you think that sometimes GPs were dismissive of what detainees were telling them about their condition or symptoms?
Possible.
I just want to ask you about one particular complaint that you investigated and responded to in particular. It's at CJS 001616. If that could be brought up on screen, please. And if we go to page 3. This is a complaint by a detainee known as D2953. He complains about various things, partly about the doctor and other medical staff in Brook House not wanting to give them his medication, so a similar complaint to those that I've asked you about.
Yeah.
You investigated the healthcare aspect of this complaint because that was your role, as you've told us. Who allocated complaints to you generally, or was it just something that was part of your role, so it was always you who did it?
It was allocated allocated down from the office, well, up the security side of things. They allocated it down.
And was there anyone in particular who would inform you of a complaint that you needed to investigate?
No, I can't remember that it was. No.
Do you remember in relation to this particular one who allocated it to you?
No, sorry.
Do you know part of this detainee's complaint that didn't relate to healthcare was that he had been punched 3 times by a DCO, Derek Murphy? Do you know who was responsible for investigating the non-healthcare elements of this?
The security side of the welfare sort of.
And again, was there anyone in particular who had that role as you did in healthcare?
I can't remember the name, but there would have been someone there. Yeah.
And what sort of level would they be? Would they be senior management or
Senior management? Yeah.
in the security team?
Yeah.
Thank you. That can be taken down now. Thank you. At paragraphs 106, 107 of your statement, you mentioned that interpreters in Brook House weren't always readily available for healthcare appointments. Is that right?
That's right.
Did that seem to be a consistent problem in 2017, or was it?
Just occasionally a problem, yeah.
Did that occur in reception's screening on detainees' arrival to Brook House as well as in other appointments? Do you know?
Not that I can't remember if they was. It's possible, but I can't remember.
What would you do if an interpreter wasn't available and the detainee didn't speak good English?
I would ask them that we would have to try and find an interpreter. It might not be that day, but we would ring out and see if we could get an interpreter at another time.
And did that happen in relation to screening on arrival to Brook House as well? Were there delays in healthcare screening and GP appointments?
I don't recall, but I don't know.
You also mention at paragraph 74 that a leaflet that was given to some detainees containing information about healthcare, such as medication times and healthcare opening times. So relatively basic information about the provision of healthcare in Brook House. Is that right?
Yes, yeah.
Did that leaflet contain any information about Rule 34 assessments?
They should have been told about the Rule 34 assessment, so that they, when they came in and they went to we would explain to them that they would needed to be seen by the doctor the next day for the second part.
So they were told that they would see the doctor for an appointment the next day. Were they specifically told about Rule 34 and its purpose?
I don't remember that they were, no.
Were you aware of delays in Rule 34 appointments being carried out by a GP in 2017?
I don't recall, I can't remember.
You say, in terms of the adults at risk policy, were you aware of that statutory guidance that you were expected to apply as a healthcare professional in 2017?
I'm only, yeah, I suspect so. I can't remember, but I should have done that.
Did you have an understanding of what an adult at risk was?
Yeah.
And were you aware of the purpose of the policy?
So it was that we were to follow guidelines and ensure that the patients were looked after if they were vulnerable adults. So.
It's not just about looking after vulnerable adults, though, is it? It ties in with the Rule 34 and 35 safeguards to identify those who are vulnerable so as to notify the Home Office that they may not be suitable for detention.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes.
Were you aware of that in 2017?
I don't know. I can't remember.
Do you think your staff had a good understanding of that policy?
I'm not sure.
At paragraph 141 of your statement, you describe Rule 35 as being for the protection of detainees from being returned to a place of torture. Was that your understanding of Rule 35?
Some of it, yes. But it was also, I had to look it up again, and it was also to do with mental health and vulnerability as well.
So it tying in with the adults at risk policy, it was its purpose was to identify those who were vulnerable in detention, to notify that fact to the Home Office so they could consider it when making detention decisions. Did you understand that at the time in 2017?
Would have referred it to the patients who are for Rule 35 to the doctors. But I would not necessarily have informed the Home Office at that time. I don't know.
Were you aware of the 3 different limbs of the rule?
I wasn't. I couldn't remember it, but I had to look it up.
So you looked it up for the purpose of giving your evidence to the inquiry. We know that you've retired and you stopped working at Brook House in 2018. Do you think you were aware of the 3 different limbs of the rule in 2017?
I think so, but I can't remember. I should have done this.
Because they considered different issues, didn't they?
Yeah.
We could just perhaps bring it up on screen to look at the 3 different subsections. It's CJS 006120. And if you just go to page 11, please. Thank you. So we see subsection 1, the medical practitioner shall report to the manager on the case of any detained person whose health is likely to be injuriously affected by continued detention or any conditions of detention. Subsection 2 deals with a suspicion of a detained person having suicidal intentions. Do you see that? And subsection 3 is a case where the detained person may have been a victim of torture. At paragraph 143 of your statement, you say that if a detainee revealed something to a nurse in a consultation that indicated he should receive a Rule 35 report due to deterioration in his health, or it was likely his health would deteriorate in detention, then I would expect a nurse to report this to the Home Office and refer the detainee to the GP for a Rule 35 report. You seem there to be talking about Rule 35(1). Do you agree?
Yes, sir.
How would the nurse report this to the Home Office?
She would. I'm not sure if the nurse would actually report it to the Home Office. She would have to go through the Rule 35 with the doctor.
Yes,
and, yeah.
because it's the GP who carries out a Rule 35 assessment and writes the report.
Yeah.
So is your statement just wrong here when it says you would expect a nurse to report it to the Home Office?
If they were concerned about him being really vulnerable, yes, I would expect them to try and inform the Home Office as well.
And how would they do that?
They could write Part C.
And do you think your nursing staff were routinely doing that in 2017?
Possibly not, no.
No. You go on in this paragraph. If the detainee revealed that he had suicidal intentions, I would expect the nurse to refer the detainee to an RMN for further assessment. I would also expect an ACDT to be opened for this detainee and a Rule 35 appointment to be made. How did you communicate that expectation to your nursing staff?
To expect them to, I would speak to them and hopefully talk to them about it and explain how to open ACDT and how to refer them to for Rule 35.
That was something you were instructing them to do?
Yeah.
In 2017?
Hopefully, yeah.
Were you aware that Rule 35 reports weren't routinely being done under Rule 35.1 and Rule 35.2 in 2017?
I can't recall. Sorry.
Because we know that there were, in 2017, 8 Rule 35.1 reports and no Rule 35.2 reports at all. Was that something you were aware of in 2017?
I wasn't aware, no.
Why not, if you're line managing and clinically supervising your staff as clinical lead?
Well, I can't remember that there had been such a low with 35, so I can't remember, I honestly can't remember.
Do you think you were monitoring in any way or auditing the number of reports done under Rules 35.1 and 35.2 in 2017?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Was there any system for monitoring or auditing the numbers of reports made?
There was a audit on the system one that they should have been audited on there. But I wasn't involved in that. The audits were usually done by the line managers.
Given the high numbers of ACDTs open in 2017 and the low numbers of Rule 35.1 reports and complete absence of Rule 35.2 reports, do you agree, as Sandra Calver did, that those safeguards under Rule 35 were failing?
Yeah.
Whose responsibility was that?
It's responsibility. It would have been down to us and our line managers that we should have been more aware of it.
Yes. At paragraph 145, you say that only a GP could write a Rule 35 report, as we've just discussed. But at paragraph 147, you say, when assessing a detainee for the purposes of a Rule 35 report, the detainee would be questioned about his past history in a private room. We would ask the detainee, I think, if they had any scarring and mark the scars on a body map. We would conduct a full assessment and record all answers for the GP. You seem here to be referring to Rule 35.3 reports in relation to victims of torture. Do you agree?
Okay.
What do you mean by the use of the word we? We would ask the detainee, we would conduct a full assessment.
That was what I would have done before I became clinical lead, when I was on the floor doing. That's how I asked the detainee if they were had any scarring, why, what the problems were, if they were tortured. That's how I would assess them.
So who was doing the assessment then? Was it the nurse and the GP, or?
Sometimes when the detainee came in with questions about 35, then the nurse would ask them those questions and do that assessment, just to hand over to GPs that you'd seen them and they help them.
So it was part of a referral process to the GP?
Yeah.
Because the rule requires, doesn't it, we looked at it, that it's the medical practitioner who does the Rule 35 assessment and the report.
Yeah.
And that's the GP.
Yeah.
Were nurses carrying out Rule 35 assessments in Brook House in 2017?
No.
Because that would certainly exceed the remit of a nurse, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
In contravention of the rule.
Yeah.
At paragraph 22 of your statement, you say you can't remember doing any refresher courses for Rule 35 training. Did you have any Rule 35 training?
I vaguely remember going to Harmondsworth to see about Rule 35, which was another IRC, but I can't remember why I went and what happened, but I didn't have any further refreshments on that.
Your nursing staff didn't routinely attend any Rule 35 training?
No.
Would it have been helpful if they had?
Yes.
Particularly given their important role in referring to the GP as the only person who's able to carry out a Rule 35 assessment and write a report.
Yeah.
In relation to the assessment of vulnerability due to mental ill health, symptoms of trauma and conditions such as PTSD are important and a relevant consideration, aren't they?
Yes.
Were you confident that you and your staff in 2017 could identify symptoms of trauma and PTSD?
No, not confident.
No. Sandra Carver equally wasn't confident, and she thought that the reason was that there probably wasn't enough specific training on PTSD for the nursing team or on torture awareness. Did you yourself have any specific training on PTSD or torture awareness? No. And your staff didn't?
No.
So do you think your staff had sufficient understanding of the first two limbs of the Rule 35 in 2017?
No, I don't think.
No. That's a significant gap in knowledge and the safeguards, isn't it?
Yeah.
There should have been significantly more Rule 35.1 and Rule 35.2 reports in 2017. And the fact that there weren't suggests, and Sandra Carver accepted, that really too high a threshold for referral for those reports was being applied. Is that right?
That's fine.
You'd agree with that?
Yes.
That also contributed to the safeguards failing.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about some more about healthcare's role in use of force. You agreed with me that in a planned use of force, so one that you know is going to happen, the healthcare's role is to identify to detention staff any contraindications, any reasons why force shouldn't be used against a detainee. Is that right?
That's right. And
to raise any concerns in relation to clinical matters with the detention staff,
yeah.
so that they're aware.
Yeah.
How would that assessment be carried out? You mentioned a review of the medical records prior to the briefing, is that right?
Yes.
Would you assess the detained person themselves in person?
No, I don't recall that we did, but
No. Why not?
I can't. I don't know.
It just wasn't the practice at the time.
No.
Didn't you consider it important to undertake a clinical risk assessment?
It should have. Yeah. No.
It should have happened.
Then it should have happened.
Would you agree that an important part of that risk assessment is a consideration that a use of force may have quite a serious negative impact on a person's mental health?
Possibly, yeah.
Restraint could lead to a worsening of someone's mental ill health symptoms, for example. It could certainly cause them distress.
Stress. Yeah.
In an unplanned use of force, the healthcare role would be to attend and to monitor the detained person, providing clinical advice and to raise concerns if necessary. Is that right?
That's right.
And you and your staff were aware of that role at the time?
I think so, yeah.
I want to just look at some specific incidents that you were involved in where force was used on a detainee. The first one is in relation to D2159, who was removed from the wing to E-wing using force. And if we could look at, please, CJS 007001. Thank you. This is his medical record, and we see that on the 5th of April 2017, he was seen by a nurse, or a nurse access role, Raymond Little, at 10:20 in the morning. He was unwell. he was refusing food and fluid, and he had urinated on the floor, and he was put onto an ACDT, and the nurse expressed concerns about him. Is that right? The next entry, the same day, notes he's incontinent, and the nurse again was expressing concerns about him and his general welfare, and asked if a psychiatrist ought to assess him. You then saw him. We see your entry at 15:58 on the same day, and you felt that it was in his interest to move to E-wing so he could be observed more closely, and there were concerns over his welfare. Were detainees where there were concerns over their welfare, for example, as it appears here in relation to food and fluid refusal, routinely removed to E-wing?
If they were poorly, yeah.
And was that because E-wing had the cells where observations could be conducted through the bigger panel?
Yeah, those, yeah.
You say restraints may be used. Did you mean there restraints such as handcuffs, or did you mean a use of force such as control and restraint?
I meant just not handcuffed or use of force on
Use
them.
of force, a use of force.
No, not use of force, but just to stop him from asking him to come, so holding his hand rather than anything else.
Do you see holding someone's hand as restraint?
But if they didn't want to come with them, then yes, I would. Yeah.
There's nothing in this entry that indicates that you spoke to D2159 about relocating him for his own protection. Do you think you did do that or not?
I don't recall, but I probably. Yes.
Wouldn't it be important to inform a detainee the reasons why they were moving?
Yeah.
The next entry in the medical records just below yours, again from Mr. Little, says that he was moved from D-wing to E-wing by officers, no force required as detainee fairly weak, no injuries noted on detainee. So the medical record seems to indicate that force wasn't used on him, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's not accurate, we know, and if we could just look at CJS 005529. This is the use of force form relating to his removal to E-wing from that date, the 5th of April. So we know that force was used upon him and that it was planned. Page 2, please. Again, confirms in the middle with the cross there that it was a planned use of force. If we just go to page 3, please. We see there the type of force used upon him, don't we? Guiding hold, isolating the arm, inverted wrist hold, figure 4 arm hold, and that he was seated. We also see at the bottom that he was handcuffed for a period of 5 minutes. Do you see that?
Yeah.
That's considerably more force than holding his hand, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
Is that what you had envisaged when you said in the medical record restraints may be used?
I didn't expect them to do a planned use of force, no.
We also know it was a 4-person CNR team in full PPE, including the use of a shield. Did you expect that?
No, I didn't expect that.
At one point, he was said to appear to be resisting because he dropped to his knees, but it's noted that he's on food and fluid refusal. That could be an indication of physical weakness, couldn't it?
Yes.
Why is it that the medical record records no use of force when this documentation clearly records a significant use of force against him?
I can't understand.
So. Was it part of healthcare's role to sanction or to approve a use of force against a detained person?
No.
Do you accept that that is effectively what you did here by writing in the medical record restraints may be used? that you effectively approved a use of force against this person?
Well, if that's how it's written, but that's not how I should have written it.
Your role was to raise concerns or contraindications.
Yes,
You
yeah.
didn't raise any here, did you?
That I can't remember that I had it.
And it was a monitoring role during the use of force for the welfare of the detainee. John Collier, who's an expert the inquiry has instructed on the use of force, criticises this use of force on someone who he says was physically weak, and he says it was completely disproportionate to the risk he presented. He says that handcuffs were not appropriate and the use of a shield was not necessary, reasonable or proportionate. Would you agree, looking at it now, that force shouldn't have been used upon him to move him to E-wing?
That's wrong.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
It was wrong.
It was
should have
wrong.
been,
Shouldn't you have intervened to raise contraindications, reasons why the use of force shouldn't be happening at the time?
With hand, yes.
Both prior to the use of force in the medical record, you should have raised concerns at that time, shouldn't you?
Yeah.
I just want to look at one. I'm conscious of the time. I have one more incident I wish to look at. I shouldn't be too long.
Thank you, Mr. McCock.
This is in relation to D2054's removal, a planned removal, on the 28th of June 2017. And if we could just look at HOM 002389, please. And when it comes up, it's page 14. Thank you. It's a little tricky to read. But this is a case where you saw D2054 2 days before his planned removal on the 26th of June. And this document, we can just about read, says that you made an urgent mental health referral in relation to him because he was low in mood, he was on an ACDT, and he had some thoughts of self-harm, and it's the section in the middle that's in capital letters. You were clearly concerned about his mental health and well-being,
Yeah.
and that's the reason you wanted a mental health referral. On the day, on the 28th of June, he had self-harmed in the morning when he was told of his removal directions, and he'd made some superficial lacerations to his arm. Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember that one.
If we look at, please, CJS 005991, please. And it's page 9. This is the PSU report into this incident. And right at the bottom, at paragraph 6.2.3, we see there that he had been under constant supervision following a self-harm attempt and moved to safer custody rooms where he could be observed through the glass door, and that's E-wing, as you've described. And then he was searched, and if we just go on to the next page, please, at the top, 2 blades were found and removed from him. So things by this stage had escalated from thoughts of self-harm to actual self-harm, hadn't they? And that was of concern. He was clearly vulnerable, but by this time, no mental health assessment had been carried out. Why on the 28th of June had you not again arranged for an urgent mental health assessment to be carried out prior to his removal?
I don't remember.
It should have been, shouldn't it?
Should have been, yeah.
We know that there was a briefing before the planned removal, and in that briefing you had stated that there were no medical concerns. It's recorded in the PSU report, but I won't take you to it for reasons of time, if you can accept it from me. why had you not raised medical concerns about a use of force on this man, given what you have recorded in relation to his vulnerability?
I honestly can't remember.
You should have done.
I should have done, yes.
You didn't raise any concerns or contraindications, reasons why force shouldn't be used against him. Do you accept that you should have done that at the time? Well, let's just look at what the use of force upon him. You were present during his removal. Again, the PSU report records that you watched through a glass window. That would be the window to the cell that he was housed in on Ewing, would it?
Yeah.
You would have seen then that he was lying on the bed and that a shield was put on top of him and that he was restrained on the floor face up and put in an arm hold by a 4-person control and restraint team. It was your job to monitor. You would have ensured that you could see what was happening. Would that be right?
That's right.
They used various different holds on him, isolating arm, arm lock and head support, and handcuffs again were used for approximately 2 minutes. During this time, he was extremely distressed. He was shouting, "Jesus, Jesus," repeatedly. Would that not have been a reason to intervene and raise a concern?
Possibly, I'm not.
When he was moved out of the room, he was naked and had only a towel to cover his genitals, and he was maintained in the arm hold for a period of 10 minutes and handed over to TASCOR, the escort service, in handcuffs and still maintaining the arm hold, and he was crying out, "This is the end of my life." You didn't raise any concerns at the time. You should have done, shouldn't you?
I should have done that.
Did you consider the treatment, particularly that he was naked, to be degrading?
Yeah.
Why didn't you raise that at the time?
I'm not sure why.
Did you consider checking with the detention staff whether the maintaining of the force upon him throughout was necessary?
I can't remember if I did or not.
Your witness statement to the PSU, if we just bring it up on screen, it's HOM 002402. This is the witness statement that you made to the PSU following this incident. You say in the middle there, "I do not recall him banging his head or losing consciousness. I do remember him shouting a lot, but do not recall him saying his head hurt. The team applied handcuffs and he was stood up. I checked him over. He did not appear to have any apparent injuries at that time. His arm still had his dressing intact, and I did not see his wound on his arm, and there was no bleeding on the dressing." Would you agree that you seem primarily focused here on his previous physical injury or having any physical injury caused him during the use of force? So the wound on his arm and whether he banged his head or not.
Yeah.
There isn't any mention of his mental health or vulnerability here, is there?
No.
That was important to your safeguarding role. Do you think you gave that adequate consideration at the time?
I can't remember if I did or not.
And you've accepted that you really should have raised concerns over the use of force prior to it being planned.
Yeah.
Did you ever, in 2017, raise concerns or reasons why force shouldn't be used at all prior to it being planned?
I can't remember now.
Thank you, Chair. Those are all the questions I have for this witness. Do you have any questions?
Thank you. No, I don't have any questions, Ms Williams. Thank you very much for coming to give your evidence. I appreciate it's not an easy experience, but I'm grateful for you coming today.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Very sorry I've gone slightly past 1 o'clock, but could I still suggest we come back at 2?
Indeed. Thank you very much,
Thank
Mr
you.
Simcock. See you at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
All rise.